Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. The signal. Sarah Chen pushed her reading glasses up her nose and squinted at the stack of physics tests that seemed to multiply on her kitchen table. The red ink from her grading pen had long since stained her fingertips, and the coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago. Outside her apartment window, Millfield slept under a blanket of October darkness. The kind of deep, quiet dark that only small Maine towns could manage. She glanced at the clock on her microwave. 3:31 a.m. Another sleepless night. Another marathon grading session that would leave her hollow-eyed and running on caffeine fumes when she faced her students in 4 hours. The insomnia had gotten worse since Dad died, as if sleep itself had become another thing she'd lost along with him. The radio on her nightstand crackled to life. Sarah's pen stopped mid-correction on Tommy Morrison's particularly creative interpretation of Newton's laws. The bedside radio was one of those ancient clock radios that belonged in a museum, complete with actual dials and an antenna that she had to adjust by hand. She'd inherited it from her father along with his research papers and his stubborn refusal to upgrade to digital anything. The thing barely picked up the local stations on a good day. Now it was broadcasting something. Not music, not talking. Something that sounded like voices speaking underwater, or maybe backwards. The words, if they were words, seemed to tumble over each other in a rhythm that made her skin crawl. She could almost understand them, the way you could almost understand someone talking in the next room through thin walls. Sarah set down her pen and walked to the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. The radio's green display read 3:33 a.m. exactly, and the frequency indicator danced between stations like it couldn't decide where to land. The strange broadcast grew louder as she approached, not quite static, but not quite anything else either. She reached for the power button, then hesitated. Her father had been a physicist, the kind who believed in recording anomalies first and explaining them later. He would have grabbed his notebook and started documenting. Instead, Sarah twisted the tuning dial. The signal followed her across the frequencies. Whatever was broadcasting wasn't coming from any single station. It moved with her as she turned the dial, maintaining the same garbled intensity on 88.3 as it did on 105.7. The voices, and she was becoming more certain they were voices, seemed to be calling something, or someone, a name that sounded almost like hers. Sarah snapped the radio off. The sudden silence felt heavier than the strange broadcast, pressing against her eardrums like the quiet after a thunderclap. She stood there for a moment, listening to the normal sounds of an old building at night, the furnace cycling on, the refrigerator humming, the soft tick of the grandfather clock downstairs in Miller's pharmacy. She was overtired. That had to be it. Her mind was playing tricks, manufacturing mystery where none existed. Tomorrow she would check the radio during daylight hours and find it was picking up some late-night talk show, or maybe interference from the new cell tower they'd installed outside of town. But sleep felt even more impossible now, so she returned to her kitchen table and the stack of tests. Tommy Morrison thought momentum could be created from nothing if you concentrated hard enough. Jennifer Walsh had confused velocity with acceleration again. Normal problems with normal solutions, the kind that didn't broadcast themselves on broken radios at 3 a.m. The school day began with chaos, as they always did. Sarah had managed exactly 47 minutes of sleep between her radio incident and her alarm, leaving her feeling like she'd been turned inside out and reassembled incorrectly. She stumbled through her morning routine, grateful that she'd laid out her clothes the night before, a habit her mother had drilled into her that had proven invaluable during her year of scattered grief. Millfield High School squatted on Elm Street like a red brick monument to institutional efficiency. Sarah had taught there for 2 years now, ever since she'd moved to Maine to settle her father's affairs and somehow never left. The building smelled like floor wax and teenage anxiety, a combination that had become oddly comforting. "You look like hell," said Tom Brewster, sliding into the chair across from her in the faculty lounge. Tom taught shop class and ran a small electronics repair business out of his garage, the kind of man who could fix anything with moving parts and most things without them. His grey beard was perpetually flecked with sawdust, and his flannel shirts had the soft wear of actual work clothes rather than fashion statements. Didn't sleep, Sarah admitted, clutching her coffee like a lifeline. Radio kept me up. Radio? Tom raised an eyebrow. That old thing of your dad's? Figured that museum piece would have given up the ghost by now. Before Sarah could respond, the lounge door burst open, and Jenny Martinez practically fell through it. Jenny taught freshman English, and had the frazzled energy of someone trying to convince teenagers that Shakespeare was relevant to their Snapchat lives. Has anyone else's class been completely insane today? Jenny asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Half my first period kids look like extras from a zombie movie. Dark circles, can't focus, jumping at every little sound. Tom set down his coffee. Emma was up most of the night, kept saying she had bad dreams, but she couldn't remember what about. Just kept checking the clock, waiting for something. Waiting for what? Sarah asked, though something cold was settling in her stomach. 3:30, Tom said. She kept checking the clock, expecting something to happen at 3:30. The lounge fell quiet except for the hum of the ancient coffee maker and the distant sound of locker doors slamming. Sarah thought about the radio crackling to life at 3:33 a.m, about voices that might have been calling her name. Probably just the weather, Jenny said, but she didn't sound convinced. Barometric pressure changes can affect sleep patterns. Read that somewhere. Tom nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Maybe. Emma's been having electronic problems too. TV keeps switching channels on its own. Cell phone acting up. Brought her laptop to the shop yesterday because it was showing weird images. Desktop background kept changing to pictures she'd never seen before. What kind of pictures? Sarah asked. Empty places, like really empty. Streets with no cars, buildings with no lights. Asked her where she'd downloaded them, but she swore she'd never seen them before. Tom shrugged. Kids download all kinds of stuff without thinking about it. Probably picked up some virus. The warning bell rang, sending them all scrambling for their respective classrooms. Sarah's first period AP Physics class filed in with the usual mix of teenage energy and pre-coffee sullenness. But something was different. Tom was right. Half of them looked like they'd spent the night fighting invisible monsters. Rough night? She asked as they settled into their seats. Marcus Webb, her star student and the class clown, raised his hand. Mrs. Chen, have you ever had the same dream as someone else? What do you mean? Like Kelly and I were texting last night and we both had this weird dream about the school being empty. Same dream, same details. Even the same time, around 3:30 in the morning. Kelly Fitzpatrick nodded from the back row. It was so real. The hallways were all dark and there was this sound coming from the PA system. Not words, just... I don't know how to describe it. Static? Sarah asked before she could stop herself. Yeah, Marcus snapped his fingers. Exactly like static, but organised, like it meant something. Sarah felt the coffee turn to acid in her stomach. Around the classroom, other students were nodding, sharing glances that suggested they'd all visited the same impossible place in their sleep. Dreams can seem very real, she said carefully. Sometimes when we're stressed or anxious, our brains create vivid scenarios that feel like actual memories. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Not when combined with Tom's story about Emma, or the radio broadcast that had followed her across frequencies. The lesson on electromagnetic waves felt surreal, given the circumstances. Sarah found herself explaining how radio signals travelled through space, how they could be disrupted by atmospheric conditions, how sometimes signals from distant stations could bounce off the ionosphere and appear in unexpected places. So you could hear something that wasn't really there? Asked Marcus. Not exactly, Sarah said. You'd be hearing something real, just not from where you expected. Radio waves don't lie, but they don't always tell you the whole truth either. After class, Marcus lingered behind while the other students filed out for second period. Mrs. Chen? That dream I mentioned? Kelly wasn't the only one. I've been texting with kids from other classes, and a lot of us had the same thing. Empty school, weird static sounds, all around 3:30 a.m. That's not normal, right? Sarah looked at her best student, a kid who could calculate orbital mechanics in his head but still believed in ghost stories. No, Marcus, that's not normal. My dad thinks there's something wrong with the radio station, he continued. WMIL's been having technical difficulties all week, equipment failures, weird feedback loops. He runs the soundboard at the station on weekends and he says the equipment's been acting like it's receiving signals from somewhere else. Somewhere else? Not just other stations, like really somewhere else. The signal analysis shows frequencies that shouldn't exist coming from directions that don't make sense. Marcus hefted his backpack. He thinks someone might be trying to hack the station, but the signals aren't coming from any known transmitter. After Marcus left, Sarah stood alone in her classroom, staring at the whiteboard where she'd drawn diagrams of radio waves propagating through space. Her father had been obsessed with electromagnetic theory toward the end of his life, filling notebooks with equations that she'd never fully understood. Something about signal bleeding, about frequencies that could cross dimensional barriers. She'd thought it was the cancer affecting his mind, now she wasn't so sure. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tired students and malfunctioning electronics. The PA system crackled with interference during announcements. 3 different teachers reported problems with their computers. The school's ancient television in the main office kept switching to channels that didn't exist, showing brief flashes of empty hallways and ash-covered streets before returning to normal programming. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah had made a decision. She stopped by the main office and signed out early, claiming a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Whatever was happening in Millfield felt like an emergency. And her father's research was the closest thing to family she had left. Her apartment above Miller's pharmacy felt different in the afternoon light. Less like home and more like a temporary shelter, a place where she was staying rather than living. She made herself a sandwich she didn't want and sat at her kitchen table, looking at the stack of tests she still needed to grade. Instead, she found herself pulling out her phone and searching for information about WMIL radio station. Their website was basic, typical small-town simplicity, local news, weather, high school sports scores, nothing about technical difficulties or equipment failures. But when she called the station directly, the man who answered sounded harried. WMIL, this is Dave. Hi, I'm calling about some unusual broadcasts I've been hearing. Around 3:30 in the morning? There was a pause. You too, huh? Look, we've been getting calls all week. People hearing things that aren't on our programming schedule. But I'm telling you, we shut down at midnight. Everything's automated after that. Just the weather loop and emergency broadcasts. What about equipment malfunctions? I heard you've been having technical problems. Another pause, longer this time. Who is this? I'm a teacher at the high school. Sarah Chen. My students have been having sleep problems and I think it might be connected to whatever signal is broadcasting. Listen, Ms. Chen, I probably shouldn't be talking about this, but we've had some weird stuff going on. Equipment turning itself on, signals that don't match any known frequency allocations. The FCC's sending someone up from Portland next week to take a look. Have you tried tracking the source? That's the thing. According to our equipment, the signal's coming from inside our own building, but there's nobody here at 3 a.m, and the transmitter room is locked up tight. It's like the building's broadcasting to itself. Sarah thanked Dave and hung up, but the cold feeling in her stomach had only gotten worse. She walked to her bedroom and stared at the old radio on her nightstand. Her father's radio, inherited along with his boxes of research and his collection of old scientific journals. For the first time since his death, she found herself wishing she'd paid more attention to his work. The storage unit was in the basement of Miller's pharmacy, a musty concrete room that Mr. Miller let her use for free in exchange for occasionally helping with inventory. She'd moved most of her father's things down there after the funeral, unable to throw them away but not ready to live with the constant reminders of his absence. 3 boxes of his research sat stacked against the far wall, covered in dust and labelled in his careful handwriting. Electromagnetic theory, signal analysis, and personal projects. She'd looked through them once shortly after the funeral, but the technical language and complex equations had been too much to handle in her grief. Now she pulled down the personal projects box and carried it back upstairs. The box contained exactly what she remembered. Notebooks filled with her father's tight script, photocopies of scientific papers, and newspaper clippings that had seemed random and obsessive when she'd first found them. But as she spread them across her kitchen table, a pattern began to emerge. Every newspaper clipping mentioned Millfield. Some were obvious: local news stories, high school football scores, the usual small-town minutiae, but others were stranger. A brief mention in a Portland paper about unusual electromagnetic readings detected in the area. A scientific journal article about frequency anomalies in rural Maine. A clipping from a Boston newspaper dated October 15, 1987, with a headline that made her hands shake. Chemical plant explosion kills 47 in Millfield, Maine. Sarah read the article 3 times before the words fully registered. A chemical processing plant on the outskirts of town had exploded in the early morning hours, releasing toxic gases that had killed 47 people and forced the evacuation of the entire town. The cause was listed as an equipment malfunction, possibly triggered by an electrical storm. She had lived in Millfield for 2 years. She had never heard of any chemical plant explosion. According to the article, the plant had been experimenting with electromagnetic processing techniques as part of a government contract. The explosion had occurred at 3:33 a.m. Sarah set the clipping down with shaking hands and reached for her father's notebook. His handwriting was smaller here, more hurried, as if he'd been racing to get his thoughts down before they escaped him. October 1987. Millfield incident confirms dimensional bleed theory. Electromagnetic explosion created frequency wound between parallel realities. Signal bleeding suggests ongoing breach. Must investigate before convergence becomes permanent. Note: official records show no chemical plant explosion. Timeline alteration suggests successful reality revision, but frequency scarring remains. Dimensional echo continues to broadcast distress signal at original incident time. Sarah's mother refuses to discuss Millfield connections, claims no knowledge of plant or explosion, memory revision, or selective reality exposure. Must protect Sarah from frequency exposure until old enough to understand implications. The notebook fell from Sarah's hands. Outside her window, Millfield looked exactly as it always had. Quiet streets, modest houses, the kind of small town where nothing ever happened and nothing ever changed. But according to her father's research, 47 people had died here in 1987, and somehow the town had forgotten, or been made to forget. The old radio on her nightstand crackled to life, even though she was certain she'd left it turned off. The green display read 3:33 p.m, 12 hours early, but the same numbers that had haunted her sleep. And from the speaker came a voice she recognized, even though it was impossible. Her father's voice, calling her name across frequencies that shouldn't exist, from a place that might not be there at all. Sarah stared at the radio for 10 full minutes after her father's voice faded into static. The green display had returned to normal time, 3:47 p.m, and the speakers emitted nothing but the usual background hum of electronics at rest. She could almost convince herself she'd imagined it, if not for the newspaper clipping still spread across her kitchen table, declaring the death of 47 people in a town that had apparently forgotten they ever existed. She needed answers, and the Millfield Public Library seemed like the logical place to start. The library occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Maple Street, complete with the kind of wraparound porch and gingerbread trim that made tourists reach for their cameras. Inside, tall windows let in the late afternoon light, illuminating dust motes that danced between towering shelves of books that probably hadn't been checked out since the Clinton administration. Mrs. Eleanor Holloway had presided over the library for longer than most people had lived in Millfield. She was the kind of librarian who remembered every book she'd ever checked out to every patron, the sort of institutional memory that small towns depended on. If anyone would remember a chemical plant explosion that killed 47 people, it would be her. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Holloway looked up from her circulation desk with genuine warmth. "How nice to see you. I don't think you've been in since you borrowed those physics textbooks for your lesson plans." "Actually, I'm hoping you can help me with some local history research," Sarah said, approaching the desk with her father's newspaper clipping in hand. "I found this article about an incident in 1987, but I can't seem to find any other information about it." Mrs. Holloway adjusted her reading glasses and examined the clipping. Her expression didn't change as she read, but something flickered behind her eyes. Confusion, or maybe recognition quickly suppressed. "I'm sorry, dear, but this must be a mistake," she said finally, handing the clipping back. "There's never been a chemical plant in Millfield. Certainly nothing that would employ 47 people. You know how small we are." "But the article is very specific. It mentions the plant being on the outskirts of town near the old timber road. There's nothing out that way but forest and the old garrison property." Mrs. Holloway's voice was patient but firm, the tone of someone correcting a persistent misconception. "Perhaps this is about a different town with a similar name." Sarah spread the clipping on the circulation desk, pointing to the dateline. "But it clearly says Millfield, Maine, and the date is October 15, 1987. You've lived here your whole life. Surely you'd remember something like this." For just a moment, Mrs. Holloway's composed expression cracked. She touched her temple with one finger, as if fighting off a headache. Of course I would remember. There's been no chemical plant, no explosion, no deaths. The words came out like a recitation, automatic and rehearsed. Now, was there something else I could help you find? Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Mrs. Holloway's response felt wrong, too certain, too quick, like someone trying to convince herself as much as Sarah. Could I look at the newspaper archives from 1987? Sarah asked. Maybe there are other articles that could explain the confusion. Of course, dear. The archived papers are in the basement. October 1987. Mrs. Holloway consulted a handwritten catalogue that looked older than Sarah. That should be in box 47B, down the stairs, third shelf from the bottom. The basement smelled like old paper and forgotten time. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as Sarah descended, revealing rows of metal shelving filled with document boxes, old yearbooks, and the accumulated paper trail of a small town's existence. Box 47B sat exactly where Mrs. Holloway had indicated, thick with dust that suggested it hadn't been opened in years. Sarah lifted the lid and found herself looking at a gap. The box contained newspapers from September and November of 1987, but October was missing entirely. Not just the October 15th edition that should have covered the explosion, but the entire month. Someone had removed every single issue. She checked the neighbouring boxes. September ended with the 30th. November began with the 1st. October 1987 had been surgically excised from Millfield's historical record. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the empty space where a month should have been. This wasn't coincidence or misfiling. Someone had deliberately removed any evidence of what had happened in October 1987, and they'd done it thoroughly enough that even the town librarian seemed to have no memory of the events, but not thoroughly enough to catch her father's research. She returned the boxes to their shelves and climbed back upstairs, where Mrs. Holloway was helping a patron find a romance novel with a shirtless man and a horse on the cover. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after what Sarah had discovered in the basement. "Mrs. Holloway, were you able to find what you needed?" the librarian asked as Sarah approached. The October 1987 newspapers seemed to be missing from the archives. Missing? Mrs. Holloway frowned. That's odd. We're usually very careful about maintaining our collections. Perhaps they were misfiled, or maybe we loaned them to the Historical Society. Have you ever heard of anyone else researching local events from 1987? Mrs. Holloway's frown deepened. Well, now that you mention it, there was a man who came in a few years ago asking similar questions, said he was writing a book about small-town disasters or some such thing. Asian gentleman, reminded me a bit of you around the eyes. Sarah's heart stopped. What was his name? Chen, I believe. Dr. Chen. He was very polite, very thorough. Spent hours going through the archives, though I don't think he found what he was looking for either. Dr. Richard Chen. Yes, that sounds right. Did you know him? He was my father. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened with sympathy. Oh my dear, I'm so sorry for your loss. He seemed like a lovely man, always asking such thoughtful questions about local history, electromagnetic phenomena, that sort of thing. What kind of questions about electromagnetic phenomena? Oh, I couldn't possibly remember the specifics. Something about radio interference patterns, unusual signal readings. He was particularly interested in reports from 1987. Mrs. Holloway paused, looking confused. Though I'm not sure why, since nothing particularly notable happened that year. Sarah left the library with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that whatever had happened in October 1987 was being actively concealed. Not just hidden, erased. From newspaper archives, from official records, and apparently from people's memories. But the cover-up wasn't perfect. Her father had found cracks in the facade, traces of evidence that someone had missed, and now those traces were leading her toward a truth that someone clearly didn't want discovered. Her next stop was Tom Brewster's electronics shop. Brewster Electronics occupied a converted garage behind Tom's house on Pine Street, the kind of cluttered workspace where every flat surface was covered with circuits, tools, and electronic devices in various states of repair. Tom was hunched over a workbench when Sarah knocked, his attention focused on a laptop computer that was displaying something she'd never seen before. "Sarah," he called without looking up. "Perfect timing, come take a look at this." She approached the workbench cautiously. The laptop screen showed what appeared to be a desktop wallpaper, but the image was unsettling, an empty street that looked familiar but wrong. It took her a moment to recognise it as Main Street in Millfield, but devoid of cars, people, or any signs of life. The buildings were the same, but they looked weathered and abandoned, as if they'd been empty for decades. "This is Emma's computer," Tom said, his voice troubled. She swore she'd never downloaded this image, but it keeps appearing as her background no matter how many times we change it. I've run every diagnostic I can think of. Virus scans, malware detection, registry cleaners. The computer's clean, but this image keeps coming back. Sarah studied the picture more closely. The empty Main Street looked like a photograph, not a digital rendering. The detail was too precise, too real. She could see individual leaves scattered on the pavement, weathering patterns on the building facades, even what looked like a thin layer of ash covering everything. "Tom, have you ever heard of a chemical plant explosion in Millfield? Something that happened in 1987? Tom straightened up, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. 1987? No, nothing like that. Why? Sarah showed him the newspaper clipping. Tom read it twice, his expression growing more confused with each pass. "This has got to be wrong," he said finally. "I was living here in 1987, just graduated high school, started working at my dad's garage. A chemical plant explosion that killed 47 people? That's not something you forget." But the article is very specific about details. The location, the time, even the company name, Meridian Chemical Processing. Never heard of it. Tom handed the clipping back, but his certainty seemed forced. "Look, Sarah, I don't know what kind of game someone's playing, but there's never been a chemical plant in Millfield. And even if there had been, an explosion that big would have made national news. You can't just cover up something like that." "Can't you?" Sarah asked quietly. Tom was quiet for a moment, looking back at the laptop screen with its impossible image of an empty town. "You think this is connected? Emma's computer problems and your newspaper article? I think there are too many coincidences. The electronic malfunctions, the missing newspaper archives, people having shared nightmares about empty buildings. And now your wife's computer is showing pictures of Millfield as a ghost town." Tom reached over and pressed the laptop's power button, holding it down until the screen went black. "Let's say you're right. Let's say something did happen in 1987, something big enough that someone wanted it erased from history. Why is it coming back now? Why are we suddenly seeing these echoes?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I think my father was investigating the same thing before he died. His research suggests that electromagnetic signals can sometimes bleeding through from somewhere else. Somewhere else like where? Like a parallel reality where the explosion did happen, where everyone in town died." Tom stared at her for a long moment. "That's insane." "Is it? Look at that image on Emma's computer. Where do you think it came from? Who took a photograph of Main Street completely empty and abandoned?" Before Tom could respond, his cell phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's Dr. Kovac." Dr. James Kovac had been Millfield's only physician for nearly 30 years, the kind of old-school country doctor who still made house calls and knew every family's medical history by heart. Sarah had met him once during her father's final illness, when they'd needed someone to sign the death certificate. "Tom, thank God!" Dr. Kovac's voice was audible even through the phone speaker tight with stress and fatigue. "I need you to come to the clinic immediately. Bring any recording equipment you have. Audio, video, anything that can document electrical phenomena." "What's wrong?" Tom asked. "It's Emma, she's here, along with 6 other people from town. They're all catatonic, completely unresponsive, but their brain activity is off the charts. It's like they're experiencing intense REM sleep while awake, and all their personal electronics are malfunctioning in exactly the same way." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "What kind of malfunctions?" "Is that Sarah Chen?" Dr. Kovac asked. "Sarah, can you hear me?" "I'm here." Their devices are all displaying the same images: empty buildings, abandoned streets, everything covered in what looks like ash or dust. But here's the really strange part. The images match real locations in Millfield, but they show the town as if it's been deserted for years. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances. "We'll be right there," Tom said. Dr. Kovac's clinic occupied a converted house on Church Street, complete with the kind of wraparound porch that had been common when the building was constructed in the 1920s. Inside, the waiting room had been expanded to accommodate more patients than usual. and the atmosphere was thick with worry and confusion. Emma Brewster lay on an examination table in the main treatment room. Her eyes open but staring at nothing. Her breathing was regular, her vital signs stable, but she showed no response to external stimuli. Beside the table, her cell phone displayed a slideshow of images that made Sarah's skin crawl. Empty classrooms at Millfield High, abandoned houses on residential streets she recognised, the town square covered in grey ash, with no people anywhere to be seen. Each image looked like a photograph rather than a digital creation, too detailed and realistic to be artificially generated. "When did this start?" Sarah asked. Dr. Kovacs consulted his notes. The first case came in around noon, Mrs. Gus Patterson from Elm Street. Her husband found her sitting in her kitchen staring at the microwave display. The microwave was showing these same images instead of the clock. By 2 o'clock, I had 3 more cases. By 4 it was 6. All displaying the same images? Identical images. Same locations, same angles, same details. But here's what really bothers me. I've been practicing medicine in this town for 30 years, and I recognise all these locations. That's definitely our high school, our town square, our main street. But I've never seen them looking like that. Tom was examining Emma's phone with the practiced eye of someone who understood electronics. The images aren't stored locally, he said. According to the file properties, they're being streamed from an external source. But there's no network activity, no data usage. It's like the phone is receiving the images from nowhere. Sarah thought about her father's research notes, his theories about frequency bleeding between parallel realities. What if they're not being streamed from anywhere in our world? Dr. Kovacs looked at her sharply. What do you mean? What if these images are coming from a version of Millfield where something terrible happened, where everyone died and the town was abandoned? The doctor's expression suggested he thought she might be having a breakdown. Sarah, I understand you've been under a lot of stress since your father's death, but look at the evidence, Sarah interrupted. 7 people, all catatonic at the same time, all experiencing the same impossible phenomenon. There are electronics showing images of places that exist but shouldn't look like that. And all of this started happening around the same time I discovered evidence of a chemical plant explosion that supposedly never happened. Tom held up Emma's phone. The timestamp on these images shows they were taken at 3:33 a.m. on October 15, 1987. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of medical equipment and the occasional car passing on Church Street. Dr. Kovacs stared at the phone display, his professional skepticism warring with the evidence in front of him. That's impossible, he said finally. Digital cameras didn't exist in 1987, and certainly not with this resolution. Unless, Sarah said quietly, they were taken with technology from a timeline where digital photography developed differently, or where the disaster that was supposed to happen in 1987 delayed technological development in some areas while accelerating it in others. Dr. Kovacs rubbed his eyes. This is insane. We're talking about parallel realities and time travel, like it's a normal medical diagnosis. Then give me a better explanation, Sarah challenged. 7 people, identical symptoms, impossible images with timestamps from 1987. What's your medical opinion? Before Dr. Kovacs could respond, every electronic device in the clinic started malfunctioning simultaneously. The blood pressure monitor began beeping erratically. The examination room lights flickered. Emma's phone screen filled with static, then cleared to show a new image. The clinic itself, but empty and covered in ash, with 7 examination tables where bodies lay covered in white sheets. And in the corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure that looked exactly like Sarah. The figure was writing something on a clipboard, checking off names on what looked like a list. When it looked up toward the camera, its face was Sarah's face, but the eyes were empty sockets filled with static. That's enough, Dr. Kovacs said, his voice shaking. He reached over and turned off Emma's phone, plunging the screen into darkness. Whatever's happening here, we need help. This is beyond anything I'm equipped to handle. But Sarah was thinking about her father's voice on the radio, calling her name across impossible frequencies, about newspaper archives with missing months and librarians who couldn't remember disasters that should have been unforgettable, about a version of herself in an abandoned clinic checking names off a list of the dead. Dr. Kovacs, she said slowly, do you have any records of unusual deaths in Millfield during October 1987? I wasn't practicing here in 1987. I moved to town in 1990. took over the practice from Dr. Williamson when he retired. He paused. Why? What happened to Dr. Williamson's records from before 1990? They were destroyed in a fire at the old clinic building. Electrical problem, apparently. Happened right before I took over the practice. Dr. Kovach's voice grew quiet. Come to think of it, that fire destroyed a lot of historical records. The old town hall burned down the same week, took most of the municipal archives with it. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. 2 major fires in the same week, both destroying records from the 1980s. 3, actually. The high school library had a fire that same month, lost most of their older yearbooks and student records. Dr. Kovach looked troubled. I never really thought about it before, but that's a lot of accidents in a very short time. Tom was staring at his wife, who remained motionless on the examination table. What if they weren't accidents? Before anyone could respond, the clinic's front door chimed as someone entered. All 3 of them turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked tired, as if he'd been travelling for hours. Dr. Kovach, my name is Agent Harrison from the Federal Communications Commission. I understand you've been experiencing some unusual electronic phenomena. Agent Harrison's arrival changed the atmosphere in Dr. Kovach's clinic from confused worry to something approaching official crisis. He was the kind of federal employee who looked like he'd stepped out of a training manual, pressed suit, serious expression, and the sort of bureaucratic confidence that came from having seen strange things before and knowing exactly which forms to fill out afterward. I'm going to need to speak with each of you individually, he said, setting his briefcase on the reception desk and pulling out a tablet. We've been monitoring unusual electromagnetic activity in this area for the past 72 hours, and we need to understand exactly what you've observed. Sarah watched him work with growing unease. Agent Harrison moved with the efficiency of someone following a well-established protocol, which suggested that whatever was happening in Millfield wasn't unique. The FCC had procedures for this. Agent Harrison, she said, how many other towns have you seen this happen to? He looked up from his tablet and for just a moment his professional composure slipped. I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing investigations, Miss Chen, Sarah Chen. My father was Dr. Richard Chen. Agent Harrison's fingers paused over his tablet. Dr. Richard Chen was your father? You knew him? We'd corresponded. Dr. Chen contacted our office several times over the past few years regarding electromagnetic anomalies in this area. He was particularly interested in what he called dimensional frequency bleeding. Harrison glanced around the clinic, taking in the catatonic patients and their malfunctioning electronics. I assume you've seen his research? Some of it. Enough to know he believed that parallel realities could bleed through via radio frequencies. Dr. Chen's theories were unconventional, but his data was remarkably accurate. Harrison closed his tablet and looked directly at Sarah. Miss Chen, I need you to understand that what's happening in Millfield is extremely dangerous, not just to the people in this clinic, but potentially to a much wider area. Tom spoke up from beside Emma's examination table. What exactly is happening? And don't give us some bureaucratic non-answer. Our friends and families are lying here like vegetables while their phones show pictures of a dead town. Agent Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the 3 of them. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. There are places, he said slowly, where the barriers between parallel realities have been damaged, usually by some kind of electromagnetic trauma, nuclear testing, massive power surges, certain types of experimental technology. When this happens, signals can cross between dimensions. And Millfield is one of these places? Dr. Kovach asked. According to our records, there was an incident here in 1987. A chemical processing plant was conducting experiments with high-energy electromagnetic fields as part of a classified government contract. Something went wrong. Sarah felt her heart racing. The explosion, it really happened. In one reality, yes, the explosion killed everyone in town and left the area uninhabitable. But somehow, the electromagnetic pulse that caused the disaster also created what Dr. Chen called a frequency wound, a breach between that reality and this one. So there are 2 Millfields? Tom asked. At least 2, possibly more. The signals your electronics are receiving are broadcast from the dead timeline, leaking through the dimensional breach. Usually the bleed-through is minimal, just occasional interference, strange dreams, minor electronic glitches, but something has changed recently. The breach is widening. Sarah thought about the radio crackling to life at 3:33 a.m, about her father's voice calling her name across impossible distances. Why now? What's different? We're not sure. But the timing corresponds with increased solar activity, and we've detected similar breaches opening in other locations. It's possible that the electromagnetic field changes are destabilizing all the dimensional wounds simultaneously. Dr. Kovacs was checking Emma's pulse, his expression grim. What happens to the people who fall into these catatonic states? Agent Harrison's hesitation told them everything they needed to know before he spoke. Their consciousness appears to be displaced, pulled into the alternate reality while their bodies remain here. In previous cases, we found that prolonged displacement usually results in permanent psychological damage, if they recover at all. Previous cases? Sarah asked sharply. How many other towns? Miss Chen, I really can't... My friends are dying, Tom interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. Emma's been lying here for hours and you're telling us her mind is trapped in some parallel universe where everyone's dead. So either tell us how to help her, or get out of our way so we can figure it out ourselves. Agent Harrison looked at the catatonic patients, then back at Tom. There is one theoretical possibility. Dr. Chen believed that someone with the right genetic markers might be able to consciously cross between realities. Someone who could navigate the breach deliberately, rather than being pulled through randomly. Genetic markers? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. Inherited sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, usually passed down through families with a history of electrical engineering or physics research. People who've spent generations working with radio equipment, studying signal propagation, that sort of thing. Sarah thought about her father's lifelong obsession with electromagnetic theory, about his radio that picked up signals from nowhere, about the way his voice had reached her across dimensional barriers. Someone like me? It's possible, but extremely dangerous. The few people who've attempted conscious dimensional crossing have, not all of them came back. Before anyone could respond, every electronic device in the clinic began malfunctioning simultaneously. The lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. Emma's phone screen filled with static, then cleared to show a live video feed of the clinic itself, but from the perspective of someone standing in the waiting room. They all turned toward the waiting room. It was empty. On the phone screen they could see themselves turning to look, but the waiting room in the video contained a figure they couldn't see with their own eyes. A tall man in a lab coat standing perfectly still, watching them through the doorway. When the figure raised his hand to wave, Sarah felt ice in her veins. It was her father. Dr. Chen, Agent Harrison whispered, but that's impossible. He died 8 months ago. The video feed showed the figure pointing toward the clinic's basement, then holding up 3 fingers, followed by 3 more, followed by 3 again. 3, 3, 3. Then the screen went black. He's trying to tell us something, Sarah said. Something about the basement and about 333. Agent Harrison was frantically tapping on his tablet. Miss Chen, I strongly advise against any attempt to what? My father spent years researching this phenomenon, and now he's somehow managed to communicate from the other side. Maybe he found a way to help these people. She was already moving toward the basement door. Tom caught her arm. Sarah, this is insane. Even if that was really your father, you don't know what's down there. I know that 7 people are trapped between realities, and the only person who might understand how to help them is trying to communicate with us. I'm not going to ignore that. Dr. Kovacs looked up from checking another patient's vital signs. For what it's worth, I vote with Sarah. These people are getting worse. Their brain activity is becoming more erratic and their body temperatures are dropping. Whatever's happening to them, we're running out of time. The basement of the clinic was cramped and cluttered, filled with old medical equipment and boxes of files dating back decades. But in the corner, behind a stack of outdated X-ray machines, Sarah found something that shouldn't have been there. A modern radio setup complete with digital frequency displays and signal analysis equipment. This wasn't here yesterday, Dr. Kovacs said, staring at the equipment. I used this basement for storage. I would have noticed this. Agent Harrison was examining the radio setup with professional interest. This is similar to equipment Dr. Chen was using in his research, but some of these components, they're not standard commercial gear. Sarah approached the radio cautiously. The frequency display was active, showing readings that fluctuated in patterns she'd never seen before. As she watched, the numbers began to stabilize around a specific frequency, 333.33 MHz. That frequency doesn't exist, Tom said, looking over her shoulder. The spectrum allocation doesn't include anything at 333.33 MHz. It does in the other reality, Agent Harrison said quietly. Dr. Chen's research indicated that the parallel timeline developed different radio frequency standards. That's why we've never been able to track the source of the signals. They're broadcasting on frequencies that don't officially exist in our reality. Sarah sat down at the radio and put on the headphones that were connected to the setup. Immediately, she could hear voices, not the backwards, garbled transmissions she'd heard before, but clear speech in what sounded like her father's voice. Sarah, if you're hearing this, then the breach has widened enough for direct communication. You need to listen very carefully. The displacement field is accelerating, and the people who've been pulled into this reality are in extreme danger. This reality? Sarah asked aloud. Dad, where are you? I'm in the Millfield where the explosion happened, where everyone died in 1987. But I'm not dead, Sarah. I'm displaced, just like Emma and the others. The difference is that I've learned to navigate between realities consciously. Tom leaned over Sarah's shoulder. Ask him how to bring them back. Dad, how do we help the people who are trapped? The displacement field is centered in the high school basement where the original experiment took place. The equipment there is still active, still broadcasting the signal that's pulling people across. Someone needs to physically enter the dead reality and shut down the transmitter. Sarah felt her hands trembling. How? At exactly 3:33 a.m., when the dimensional barrier is at its weakest. You can use the radio equipment to tune yourself to the crossing frequency. But Sarah, you need to understand, once you cross over, you'll be in a reality where the air is toxic, where radiation levels are lethal. You'll have minutes at most before the environment kills you. Agent Harrison grabbed the microphone. Dr. Chen, this is Agent Harrison with the FCC. Is there no other way to close the breach? Agent Harrison, you found my research. Dr. Chen's voice carried across the static. No, there's no other way. The transmitter can only be shut down from the dead side of the breach. And it has to be done by someone with the genetic markers necessary to survive dimensional crossing. Dad, Sarah said, what about you? You're already there. Can't you shut it down? I tried, sweetheart, but I've been displaced for too long. My connection to the living reality is too weak. I can communicate, but I can't affect physical objects anymore. It has to be someone whose primary existence is still anchored in the living timeline. Dr. Kovac's voice came down the basement stairs. Sarah, you need to get up here. Now. They rushed back upstairs to find chaos. All 7 catatonic patients were convulsing simultaneously. Their eyes rolled back, their bodies rigid with seizures. Every electronic device in the clinic was displaying the same image. The high school's basement, where ancient equipment covered in ash and corrosion was sparking and smoking. Their displacement is becoming permanent, Agent Harrison said, checking readings on his tablet. The longer they stay in the other reality, the harder it becomes for their consciousness to return to their bodies. Emma Brewster's seizure was the most violent. Tom held her hand as her body shook uncontrollably. How long do we have? At this rate, maybe an hour before the displacement becomes irreversible. Sarah looked around the clinic at the 7 people whose minds were trapped in a world of death and ash, at Tom desperately trying to comfort his wife, at Dr. Kovac frantically administering medications that couldn't treat a supernatural condition. I have to try, she said. Sarah, no. Tom looked up from Emma's bedside. It's too dangerous. There has to be another way. There isn't. Sarah was already heading back toward the basement. You heard my father. Someone with the right genetic markers has to cross over and shut down the equipment. I'm the only one who can do it. Agent Harrison followed her. Ms. Chen, even if you successfully cross over, even if you manage to shut down the transmitter, there's no guarantee you'll be able to return. The crossing process could strand you in the dead reality permanently. Then I'll be stranded with my father, Sarah said, and these 7 people will have a chance to come home to their families. She sat back down at the radio equipment and began adjusting the frequency controls according to the notes her father had left. The numbers on the display danced as she fine-tuned the settings, homing in on the exact frequency that would allow conscious dimensional crossing. Sarah, her father's voice came through the headphones. Are you sure about this? I'm sure, Dad. Just tell me what I need to do. When you cross over, you'll find yourself in the high school basement. The air will be toxic, so you'll need to work quickly. The transmitter is in room B12, behind a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. It's a large console with red warning lights. There's an emergency shutdown switch on the left side protected by a clear plastic cover. How long will I have? Minutes. Maybe 5 at most before the radiation and toxins become lethal. And Sarah, when you shut down the transmitter, both realities will be severed completely. I won't be able to communicate anymore. This might be goodbye. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking about Emma Brewster and the 6 other people whose consciousness was trapped in a world of death. About Tom holding his wife's hand as she convulsed. About all the normal, good people of Millfield who deserved to live their lives without fear of supernatural displacement. About a father who had spent his final years trying to protect them all. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Now, adjust the frequency to exactly 33.33 Hz and press the transmission button. And Sarah, whatever you see in the dead reality, don't let it convince you to stay. That world is ending. This one still has hope. Sarah made the final frequency adjustment and reached for the transmission button. Behind her, Agent Harrison was speaking rapidly into his phone, probably calling for backup that would arrive too late to matter. Tom was standing at the top of the basement stairs, his face etched with worry and gratitude. At exactly 3:33 a.m., Sarah pressed the button. The world dissolved into static and electricity, and she fell through the spaces between realities toward a high school basement where death waited in the dark. The dimensional crossing felt like being electrocuted and drowned simultaneously. Sarah's consciousness stretched across impossible distances, her sense of self scattered through frequencies that human minds weren't designed to perceive. For a moment that lasted forever, she existed in both realities at once, feeling her body in the clinic basement while experiencing the toxic air of the dead Millfield filling her lungs. Then reality snapped back into focus, and she was standing in a high school basement that looked like the aftermath of nuclear war. The first thing that hit her was the smell, a combination of ozone, ash, and something chemical that made her eyes water immediately. The air tasted metallic, wrong in ways that made her body want to reject it. Every breath burned her throat and lungs, confirming her father's warning about the toxic environment. She was in the basement of Millfield High, but it was a version of the school she'd never seen. The walls were scorched black, covered in a fine layer of grey ash that had settled on every surface like snow. Emergency lighting cast a sickly yellow glow through the corridors, creating shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The silence was absolute in a way that normal places never achieved. No hum of ventilation systems, no distant traffic, no background noise of human habitation, just the sound of her own laboured breathing and the crunch of ash under her feet as she moved deeper into the basement. Room B12 was exactly where her father had said it would be, behind a door marked "Authorised Personnel Only" in letters that had been partially melted by whatever had happened here. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped into what looked like a science fiction movie's version of a 1980s computer lab. Banks of equipment lined the walls, their surfaces covered in the same ash that coated everything else. But unlike the rest of the school, this room was still active. Red warning lights blinked in sequence across multiple consoles, and screens displayed readouts in languages she didn't recognize. The equipment hummed with barely contained energy, creating an electromagnetic field so strong she could feel it in her teeth. At the center of the room sat a massive console that looked like it belonged on a NASA launch pad rather than in a high school basement. Banks of switches, rows of indicator lights, and digital displays showing frequency readings that hurt to look at directly. On the left side, exactly as her father had described, was an emergency shutdown switch protected by a clear plastic cover. Sarah approached the console cautiously, fighting the urge to hold her breath. The toxic air was already making her dizzy, and she could feel her skin beginning to burn wherever it was exposed. She had minutes at most before the environment became lethal. She lifted the plastic cover and reached for the shutdown switch. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sarah spun around, her heart hammering. Standing in the doorway was a figure that looked exactly like her, but wrong in subtle ways. The other Sarah's skin had a greyish pallor, and her eyes reflected the red warning lights like an animal's. When she smiled, her teeth were too white against her ashen complexion. "You're not me," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from the toxic air. "Of course I am. I'm the Sarah who belongs here, in the reality where everyone made the right choices." The other Sarah stepped into the room. moving with unnatural fluidity. The Sarah who stayed to help instead of running away when things got difficult. Everyone here is dead. Death is just another state of being. We've learned to adapt. The other Sarah gestured around the room. This equipment doesn't just separate realities. It allows us to visit yours, to see what we've been missing, to reclaim what should have been ours. Sarah kept her hand near the shutdown switch while trying to understand what she was facing. You're not from this reality. You're something else, using my face. I'm exactly what you could become if you stopped fighting and accepted your responsibility. The people you're trying to save, they're better off here. No pain, no uncertainty, no difficult choices. Just perfect eternal service to something greater than themselves. Through the equipment room's windows, Sarah could see movement in the basement corridors. Figures walking with the same unnatural fluidity as the false Sarah, all of them heading toward room B12. Some she recognized. Emma Brewster, the other catatonic patients from Dr. Kovac's clinic. But their movements were wrong, coordinated, as if they were all being controlled by the same consciousness. They're not being helped, Sarah realized. They're being collected. They're being perfected. No more messy human emotions, no more conflicting desires, just pure purpose. The false Sarah moved closer. You could join them willingly. Shut down the transmitter from this side, trap everyone in this perfect reality. No more suffering, no more loss, no more painful choices. Sarah thought about her father's warning. Don't let the dead reality convince you to stay. This world was designed to seem appealing to someone exhausted by loss and responsibility. A place where difficult decisions were made by something else, where pain was eliminated along with everything that made life worth living. Where is my father? Dr. Chen refused our offer. He's being held until he reconsiders. But you're smarter than he was. You can see the logic of what we're proposing. Sarah's hand closed around the shutdown switch. The only thing I can see is that you're afraid. If this reality was really better, you wouldn't need to steal people from mine. The false Sarah's expression darkened. You don't understand what you're rejecting. The living reality is chaos, pain, inevitable death. Here, consciousness continues forever in perfect harmony. Forever as what? Puppets? Slaves? Sarah could feel her strength fading as the toxic environment took its toll. Her vision was beginning to blur, and her hands were shaking from more than fear. I've seen enough harmony to know what it costs. The false Sarah lunged forward, moving with inhuman speed. Sarah yanked down on the shutdown switch, just as fingers that felt like ice closed around her throat. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every piece of equipment in the room began sparking and smoking simultaneously. The red warning light strobed faster and faster before exploding in showers of glass and electricity. The electromagnetic field that had kept the room humming collapsed with an almost audible snap. The false Sarah's scream was inhuman, a sound that came from too many throats at once. Her grip loosened as her form began to flicker like a television with bad reception. "You've killed us all," she hissed, her voice fragmenting into multiple tones. "Without the transmitter, this reality will collapse. Everyone here will be lost forever." "Everyone here is already lost," Sarah gasped, pulling away from the disintegrating figure. "You're not saving them. You're wearing them." The false Sarah's form scattered like static, revealing glimpses of the truth underneath. Not a person at all, but something vast and hungry that had been feeding on the displaced consciousness of the living. As the entity lost cohesion, Sarah caught a glimpse of its true nature, an intelligence that existed in the spaces between realities, using dimensional breaches to harvest human awareness like a farmer collecting crops. The equipment room was filling with smoke and sparks. Sarah stumbled toward the door, her lungs burning from the increasingly toxic air. In the corridor, the collected figures of Emma and the others had stopped moving and were standing perfectly still, as if waiting for new instructions that would never come. Sarah reached Emma and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Emma, can you hear me? You need to wake up." Emma's eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. Sarah shook her harder. "Your husband is waiting for you. Tom needs you to come home." For just a moment, recognition flickered in Emma's eyes. "Sarah, where are we?" "Somewhere we don't belong. Hold my hand and don't let go." The basement was beginning to collapse around them. The shutdown of the transmitter had destabilized more than just the equipment. It was unraveling the entire dead reality. Walls were becoming transparent, showing glimpses of the living Millfield bleeding through. Sarah could see the clinic basement where her body was still seated at the radio controls, surrounded by Tom and Dr. Kovac and Agent Harrison. She pulled Emma toward the stairs, half carrying her as they climbed toward a ground level. Behind them, the other catatonic patients were beginning to move on their own, following like sleepwalkers. They were all connected now, their consciousness linked by their shared displacement experience. But as they reached the main floor of the school, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. Her father was standing in the hallway, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall man in a radiation suit, his face visible through the helmet's faceplate. She recognized him immediately from old photographs. Dr. Raymond Voss, her father's research partner, the man who had caused the original disaster in 1987. "Sarah," her father called. "This way, quickly." But something was wrong with his voice. It had the same flat, controlled quality as the false Sarahs had possessed. "Dad?" The transmitter shutdown was Phase 1, Dr. Voss said, his voice echoing strangely through the helmet's speakers. "Now we can begin the real work, merging the realities instead of simply bridging them." Sarah realized with cold horror that shutting down the transmitter hadn't ended the threat. It had changed it. Instead of slowly pulling people into the dead reality, the collapse was now forcing the dead reality to merge with the living one. And Dr. Voss, who had been trapped between dimensions for decades, was using the chaos to finally escape his prison. "Sarah, you need to trust me," her father said, but his movements were jerky, unnatural. Dr. Voss knows how to stabilize the merger, how to save both realities. Through the school's windows, Sarah could see the living Millfield beginning to change. Buildings were flickering between their normal appearance and the ash-covered versions from the dead timeline. Cars on the street were switching between occupied and abandoned. People were walking the sidewalks, but some of them cast no shadows. The dimensional wound wasn't healing, it was spreading. "You're not my father," Sarah said, backing toward the school entrance with Emma and the other patients. "You're something else wearing his form." The figure that looked like Dr. Chen tilted its head in that same unnatural way the false Sarah had moved. "I'm trying to save you, sweetheart. Save everyone. But you have to stop fighting and let the merger complete itself." Dr. Voss stepped forward, his radiation suit clanking with each movement. The original experiment was designed to create a bridge between realities, but the explosion damaged the process, trapping me between worlds for 36 years. Your father's research finally gave me the key to finishing what we started. By destroying both realities, by perfecting them. Imagine a world where death is temporary, where consciousness can exist in multiple forms, where the limitations of a single timeline no longer apply. Voss gestured toward the windows where the merger was accelerating. No more loss, no more separation, no more choosing between possibilities. Sarah understood now why her father had warned her not to let the dead reality convince her to stay. It wasn't just about personal temptation. It was about the fundamental nature of existence. The dead reality offered perfection at the cost of choice, unity at the expense of individuality, eternal life through the surrender of what made life meaningful. "There has to be another way," she said. "Some way to separate the realities without destroying them." "There is," said a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Agent Harrison emerging from what looked like thin air, his form flickering between solid and translucent. He was carrying equipment she didn't recognize. Not quite radio gear, not quite computer technology, but something that combined elements of both. "Agent Harrison, how did you get here?" "Dimensional crossing technology. We've been developing it based on your father's real research, not the corrupted version Dr. Voss has been feeding us." Harrison began setting up his equipment. "The FCC has been dealing with dimensional breaches for 40 years. This isn't the first time we've had to perform an emergency separation," Dr. Voss snarled, his friendly demeanor dropping completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The merger is necessary. The barriers between realities are failing everywhere. Soon, all of human consciousness will need to exist in the spaces between dimensions. Or," Harrison said, connecting cables and adjusting settings, "we can reinforce the barriers and keep the realities separate, as they're supposed to be." The false Dr. Chen lunged toward Harrison's equipment, but Sarah stepped between them. She could feel the dimensional instability around them, the way reality kept shifting and changing as the two timelines tried to occupy the same space. Dad, if any part of you is really in there, help me stop this. For just a moment, the false Dr. Chen's expression flickered. Behind the controlled, puppet-like movement, Sarah caught a glimpse of her father's real consciousness, trapped and struggling against whatever force was controlling his displaced form. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice finally his own, "the equipment." "Harrison's equipment, you need to tune it to the inverse frequency. 666 beers. It will create a harmonic resonance that forces the realities apart." Dr. Voss roared in rage and charged toward them, but his radiation suit made him slow and clumsy. Harrison finished his adjustments and activated the equipment just as Voss reached them. The separation happened all at once, like a rubber band snapping back into position. Sarah felt the world lurch sideways, reality reasserting itself with violent finality. The ash-covered school dissolved around them, replaced by the clean, normal basement of the living Millfield High. But the transition wasn't gentle. Sarah felt her consciousness being yanked back across dimensional barriers, her sense of self scattered and reformed in ways that left her gasping and disoriented. Emma and the other patients collapsed, their displaced consciousness finally returning to their bodies in Dr. Kovac's clinic. When the world stopped spinning, Sarah found herself lying on the basement floor of the clinic, surrounded by worried faces. Tom was holding Emma's hand as she blinked slowly back to awareness. The other catatonic patients were stirring, confused but alive. "Is it over?" Dr. Kovac asked. Agent Harrison was packing up his equipment, his expression grim. "The immediate crisis is resolved. The realities have been separated and the breach has been sealed. But Dr. Voss," he paused. "Dr. Voss managed to cross over into our reality during the merger attempt. He's here now, in the living timeline." Sarah sat up slowly, her head still spinning from the dimensional crossing. "Where?" "We're tracking him. He'll be contained." Harrison looked at her with something approaching respect. "Miss Chen, what you did was incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. You saved 7 lives and prevented a dimensional catastrophe. What about my father?" Harrison's expression softened. "Your father's consciousness was tied to the dead reality's version of the transmitter. When you shut it down, you freed him to move on. He's at peace now." Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of grief and relief. Her father was truly gone now, but he was no longer trapped between worlds, no longer suffering in the spaces between realities. Emma Brewster squeezed Tom's hand and looked around the clinic with confused wonder. "I had the strangest dream," she said. "I was in our house, but it was empty and covered in dust. And there was this voice telling me I could stay forever if I wanted, that I'd never have to worry about anything again." "But you chose to come home," Tom said, tears in his eyes. "Of course I did. I couldn't leave you." As the reunited families celebrated and Dr. Kovac checked his recovered patients, Sarah stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The town looked exactly as it always had. Quiet streets, modest houses, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. But she knew now that beneath the surface reality was far more fragile than most people understood. Dimensional barriers could be damaged, consciousness could be displaced, and there were intelligences in the spaces between worlds that saw human awareness as a resource to be harvested. The good news was that there were also people like Agent Harrison and his team, working to maintain the barriers and protect the integrity of individual timelines. Her father's research would live on, helping to prevent future disasters. As she walked back to her apartment above Miller's pharmacy, Sarah realized that her life in Millfield would never quite be normal again. She would always be listening for radio signals that shouldn't exist, watching for electronics that displayed impossible images, alert for signs that the barriers between realities were weakening. But that was okay. Someone needed to keep watch. Someone needed to remember that the world was stranger and more dangerous than it appeared, and that vigilance was the price of keeping the ordinary, precious, chaotic beauty of normal human existence safe from those who would perfect it out of existence. Above her, the stars were beginning to fade as dawn approached. Soon the sun would rise over Millfield, and the town would wake up to another normal day. Sarah smiled and went home to get some sleep. 3 weeks after the dimensional crisis, Sarah Chen stood in her classroom watching her students take their midterm exam on electromagnetic theory. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was teaching about radio waves and frequency propagation to kids who had no idea their teacher had recently saved their town by manually tuning dimensional barriers. Marcus Webb raised his hand from the front row. "Mrs. Chen, question 12 about signal interference. Are we supposed to account for theoretical parallel frequency bleeding?" Sarah nearly dropped her coffee. "What?" "You know, the thing you mentioned a few weeks ago about signals appearing from unexpected sources. I've been reading about it online, and there are some really interesting theories about—" "Stick to the standard curriculum for the exam, Marcus," Sarah interrupted, but she made a mental note to monitor what her brightest student was researching online. The last thing Millfield needed was teenagers experimenting with dimensional radio theory. The past 3 weeks had been an exercise in returning to normalcy while carrying the weight of extraordinary knowledge. Emma Brewster had recovered completely from her catatonic episode, though she occasionally mentioned strange dreams about empty places. Dr. Kovac had filed official reports attributing the mass medical emergency to a temporary neurological condition caused by electromagnetic interference, which was technically accurate if woefully incomplete. Agent Harrison had returned to wherever FCC agents disappeared to when dimensional crises were resolved, but not before leaving Sarah a business card with a phone number that connected directly to something called the Anomalous Signal Division. He'd also left her a small radio scanner programmed to monitor frequencies that officially didn't exist. So far, it had been mercifully quiet. After her students filed out, chattering about the difficulty of calculating wavelength propagation through various atmospheric conditions, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave. She'd been sleeping better lately, though she still found herself checking the locks on her apartment door more carefully than before. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom Brewster. "Emma wants to invite you for dinner Sunday. She says she owes you a debt she can't repay." Sarah smiled and typed back, "Tell her the debt was paid when she chose to come home instead of staying in the perfect place." She was walking to her car when she noticed the man standing by the school's main entrance. Tall, probably in his 50s, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested either a long day or a long journey. Something about his posture triggered alarm bells in Sarah's mind. He stood too still, watched too intently. "Ms. Chen," he approached with the kind of measured steps that suggested either law enforcement training or something more unsettling. "My name is Dr. Raymond Voss." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Agent Harrison had warned that Voss had escaped into the living reality during the dimensional merger, but she'd hoped he would be contained quickly. Seeing him now, free and apparently healthy, was like encountering a nightmare in broad daylight. "I know who you are," she said, calculating the distance to her car and wondering if she could reach it before he could reach her. "I'm not here to hurt you," Voss said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to warn you. The FCC agents who've been handling this situation don't understand the full scope of what's happening. And you do. I've been trapped between realities for 36 years. I've seen things that your government specialists can't imagine." Voss glanced around the empty parking lot. The breach in Millfield wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Something is systematically weakening the barriers between dimensions, and the frequency attacks are increasing. Sarah thought about Agent Harrison's equipment, his casual mention of other dimensional breaches, the way he'd handled the crisis with practiced efficiency. "How many other towns?" 7 that I know of. Probably more. Each one follows the same pattern: electromagnetic experiments, mysterious equipment failures, people disappearing or falling into catatonic states. Voss stepped closer, and Sarah caught a whiff of ozone and something chemical that reminded her of the dead reality's toxic air. "Your father suspected a coordinated effort. That's why he was killed." "My father died of cancer." "Your father died because he was getting too close to the truth about who's behind the dimensional destabilization. The cancer was accelerated." Voss pulled a manila folder from his jacket. "These are copies of his real research notes, the ones the FCC confiscated after his death. He discovered that the dimensional attacks aren't random. They're targeting specific individuals." Sarah accepted the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of her father's handwriting, equations and diagrams that were far more complex than anything she'd found in his personal effects. Targeting them for what? Collection. The entity you encountered in the dead reality wasn't unique to Millfield. It's part of a larger intelligence that exists in the spaces between dimensions. It's been harvesting human consciousness for decades, using the dimensional breaches to identify and collect individuals with specific neural patterns. What kind of patterns? People with inherited sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. Scientists, engineers, radio technicians, anyone whose genetic makeup allows them to perceive and manipulate dimensional frequencies. Voss's expression was grim. People like you and your father. Sarah flipped through the research notes, seeing references to other towns, other experiments, other families whose lives had been destroyed by dimensional interference. Why are you telling me this? Because Agent Harrison and his team aren't trying to stop the entity. They're working with it. The FCC's Anomalous Signal Division isn't a protection agency. It's a recruitment operation. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Harrison had arrived in Millfield too quickly, known too much about dimensional crossing technology, handled the crisis with suspicious efficiency. And he'd left her monitoring equipment that could just as easily be tracking her activities as protecting the town. What do you want from me? Help. I've spent 36 years learning how the entity operates, how it identifies targets, how it manipulates dimensional barriers. But I can't stop it alone. I need someone who can navigate between realities without being detected. Sarah looked at the research folder, then at Dr. Voss. Both represented versions of the truth, but she had no way to know which version was accurate. Voss could be telling the truth about Harrison being part of a larger conspiracy, or he could be a desperate man trying to manipulate her into helping him achieve his own goals. I need time to think about this. Time is something we don't have. The entity is accelerating its collection schedule. 3 more breaches opened this week, 1 in Vermont, 1 in New Hampshire, 1 in upstate New York. Dozens of people are missing. Voss handed her a small device that looked like a combination radio and GPS unit. This will monitor dimensional activity in the area and alert you to new breaches. If I'm right about Harrison, his equipment is feeding your location to the entity. If I'm wrong, he shrugged, then you'll know I'm the threat, not him. After Voss left, Sarah sat in her car for a long time, staring at the monitoring device and the folder of her father's research. Everything she thought she'd understood about the dimensional crisis was now in question. Had she really saved Millfield, or had she simply completed the first phase of a larger plan to identify and catalogue people with dimensional sensitivity? Her phone rang. Agent Harrison's number appeared on the display. "Miss Chen, we need to talk. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Dr. Voss made contact with you today. We need to debrief you on that conversation immediately." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "How do you know about that?" "We've been monitoring Dr. Voss since he crossed over. He's extremely dangerous, and his information about the dimensional situation is deliberately misleading." Harrison's voice carried an edge of urgency. "Don't trust anything he told you. And I should trust you instead?" "Miss Chen, I understand that this situation is confusing, but you need to understand that Dr. Voss has been psychologically damaged by his decades of dimensional displacement. His perception of reality is severely compromised." Sarah thought about Voss's warning, about the monitoring equipment Harrison had left her, about the way the FCC agent had appeared in Millfield with precisely the right tools to handle a dimensional crisis. "I'll call you back," she said, and hung up. That evening, Sarah spread her father's research across her kitchen table and began reading in earnest. The photocopied notes were far more detailed than anything she'd seen before, filled with references to government projects, classified experiments, and a systematic pattern of dimensional interference that stretched back decades. According to her father's research, the first documented dimensional breach had occurred in 1952 at a military research facility in Nevada. Since then, breaches had been opening with increasing frequency, always connected to electromagnetic experiments and always resulting in the disappearance of individuals with specific genetic markers. But the most disturbing revelation was in her father's final notes, dated just days before his death. FCC Anomalous Signal Division established 1953, 1 year after first breach. Official mission: monitor and contain dimensional anomalies. Actual mission: facilitate entity harvest operations by identifying targets and coordinating collection events. Her father had suspected that the government agency supposedly protecting humanity from dimensional threats was actually enabling them. Sarah's hand shook as she read the final entry. Sarah exhibits strongest dimensional sensitivity in family line. Must protect her from official attention. If something happens to me, she must not trust government response teams. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your father died because he discovered the truth. The same thing will happen to you unless you help us stop the harvest. Meet me at the radio station tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. RV. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Voss was asking her to trust him based on her father's research, but the research could have been fabricated. Harrison was asking her to trust him based on his official authority, but that authority could be a cover for something sinister. Either way, people were disappearing, and she was one of the few individuals capable of investigating dimensional anomalies directly. She made her decision. At 11:45 p.m. the next night, Sarah drove to WMIL radio station carrying Voss's monitoring device and a portable radio tuned to the frequency her father had used to communicate across dimensions. If Voss was setting a trap, she wanted a way to call for help from whatever allies might exist in the spaces between realities. The radio station was dark except for the automated equipment that kept the emergency broadcast running. Voss was waiting in the parking lot, no longer wearing the rumpled suit. Instead, he wore clothes that looked like they'd been designed for dimensional travel, a metallic fabric that seemed to shimmer with its own light. "You came," he said. "I want to see proof, real evidence that the FCC is involved in these disappearances." Voss led her to a van parked behind the station. Inside was equipment that looked far more advanced than anything Harrison had used. Computers displaying real-time dimensional readings, radio gear that monitored frequencies across multiple realities, and screens showing the locations of active breaches worldwide. "This is the entity's collection network," Voss explained, pointing to a map dotted with red markers. Each marker represents a dimensional breach that's been opened in the past 5 years. Notice the pattern? Sarah studied the map. The breaches weren't random. They formed a rough grid pattern across the United States, with concentrations near major universities and research facilities. They're targeting academic communities. Specifically, they're targeting families with multi-generational involvement in electromagnetic research. The entity needs human consciousness with specific neural patterns to serve as interfaces between dimensions. Voss pulled up another screen showing detailed profiles of missing persons. Look at the backgrounds. Physics professors, electrical engineers, radio technicians, anyone whose family has worked with electromagnetic fields for multiple generations. Sarah recognized several names on the list. Colleagues from scientific conferences, authors of papers she'd read in graduate school, all missing, all with backgrounds similar to her own. What does the entity want with them? It's building an army of dimensional bridges, human minds that can consciously cross between realities and serve as anchors for larger invasion forces. Voss's expression was grim. The harvest in Millfield wasn't about collecting consciousness for feeding. It was about testing your abilities, confirming that you could serve as a bridge. But I stopped the harvest. You did exactly what the entity wanted you to do. You proved that you could navigate dimensional barriers, shut down equipment in a hostile environment, and return with your consciousness intact. You passed the test. Sarah felt sick. So when Harrison showed up with the dimensional separation equipment, he was completing the evaluation, making sure you could work with their technology and follow their protocols. Voss activated another screen showing surveillance footage of the Millfield clinic. Watch Harrison's behaviour during the crisis. He never looks surprised by anything. He has exactly the right equipment for every situation. He knows more about your father's research than he should. Sarah watched the footage with growing horror. Harrison moved through the crisis with the confidence of someone following a script, not someone improvising solutions to an unprecedented situation. The 7 people who fell, catatonic, acceptable losses. The entity needed to create a crisis significant enough to draw you out and test your abilities. Their consciousness was harvested during the process. But they recovered. Emma, the others, they're fine. Voss shook his head sadly. What came back weren't the original people. They're copies, created from the entity's analysis of the harvested consciousness. Perfect duplicates that will serve as sleeper agents until the entity is ready to activate them. Sarah thought about Emma's strange dreams, about the way all the recovered patients had been asking subtle questions about dimensional theory, about Tom's casual mention that Emma had been researching electromagnetic phenomena online. How do I know you're telling the truth? Voss handed her a device that looked like a sophisticated medical scanner. Point this at any of the recovered patients. If they're human, it will show normal neural patterns. If they're copies... Sarah didn't want to know what it would show, but she understood that she had to find out. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. If Voss was right, then everyone she thought she'd saved was actually an enemy agent, and the government organization she'd trusted was facilitating an invasion from another dimension. What do you want me to do? Help me shut down the collection network permanently. The entity has been using Earth as a staging ground for 70 years, but it's almost ready to begin the final phase. Once it has enough bridge consciousness to stabilize large-scale dimensional portals, it will begin moving its full forces into our reality. Sarah looked at the map of breach points, at the profiles of missing scientists, at the surveillance footage of her own supposed triumph in Millfield. Everything she'd believed about the dimensional crisis was wrong. She hadn't been a hero saving her town. She'd been an unwitting participant in humanity's destruction. But she was still the only person capable of crossing dimensional barriers and fighting the entity on its own terms. Where do we start? Voss smiled for the first time since she'd met him. We start by severing the entity's connection to its Earth-based assets. Every FCC facility, every monitoring station, every piece of equipment they've placed to track and collect dimensional sensitives. That's a lot of government property. Dr. Chen, we're not fighting the government. We're fighting something that's been wearing the government's face for 70 years. Voss began shutting down his equipment. Your father spent the last years of his life documenting the entity's infiltration of human institutions. It's time to use that research to take our world back. As they loaded the monitoring equipment into Sarah's car, she realized that her quiet life as a high school physics teacher was officially over. Whatever came next, it would involve traveling between realities, confronting entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions, and discovering just how deeply the invasion had penetrated human civilization. But it would also involve continuing her father's work, protecting people with dimensional sensitivity from being harvested, and ensuring that humanity's future remained in human hands. The radio in her apartment crackled to life as she got home at 3:33 a.m, but this time it wasn't broadcasting her father's voice. Instead, it carried the sound of machinery powering up, electromagnetic fields fluctuating, and something vast and alien awakening in the spaces between worlds. The entity knew she was coming. Sarah smiled grimly and began packing for a journey that would take her far from Millfield, into the hidden war for humanity's consciousness that had been raging in the shadows for 7 decades. The signal was calling, and this time she was ready to answer.